They say she took the axe, but what they never told you is why. That's where it begins. 8 seconds, 1 sentence, and the first crack in your reality. You're not here by accident. You've been summoned. Because once in a generation, a story escapes its cage. A story that's been locked away in dusty archives, whispered in the dark, and buried beneath layers of false history. This is one of those stories. Fall River, Massachusetts, 1892. A town choking on its own silence. On the surface, it was a portrait of Protestant virtue, white fences, starched collars, hymnals, and hard work. But beneath the linen doilies and Sunday school smiles was something older, something darker, a sickness passed down through bloodlines and banknotes. You want to know what happened in that house? What really happened? Then you have to let go of what you think you know. Because this isn't just about Lizzie Borden, it's about power, control, and what happens when one woman decided to shatter a system that had used her as its pawn since the day she was born. She didn't break the rules, she obliterated them. We've been told for over a century that Lizzie was either a madwoman or an innocent girl caught in the gears of Victorian injustice, that the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden were an unsolvable enigma, the work of a shadowy intruder who vanished without a trace. But those are the stories they feed the public, sanitized lies to protect the system, because if the truth were known, if the full weight of it were unleashed, it would fracture the myth of American innocence forever. Let me ask you something. What kind of system allows a girl to live like a prisoner inside her own home? No friends, no prospects, no freedom, just daily rituals of obedience under the gaze of a tyrant father and a stepmother who calculated her every move like a chess piece in a slow, suffocating game. Lizzie didn't snap. She awoke. She realized she was born into a machine that had already written the script for her life, and that if she didn't dismantle it, she'd die a ghost, a nameless woman remembered only for her obedience. But she chose something else. There were signs. Signs no one saw or chose to ignore. Locked doors during daylight. The systematic exclusion of Lizzie and her sister from family inheritance. Surveillance masked as protection. Daily humiliations served in cold meals and colder stares. And when her father changed his will, cutting out his blood daughters in favor of his second wife, the final layer of civility peeled away. What remained was not madness. It was calculation. Cold, mathematical precision, the kind men are praised for in business and war, but feared in women. Lizzie was not alone in that house. She had an unwilling witness. Bridget, the Irish maid, poor and voiceless, an immigrant girl who saw what the Borden name really meant, not legacy, not dignity, but dominion. Lizzie didn't just kill 2 people, she killed the illusion that women in that world had no power, that they couldn't retaliate, that control was permanent, and that terrified them. That's why the story you were told became a nursery rhyme. That's why she was turned into a cartoon, because the real Lizzie Borden is a threat to every system that feeds on submission. She wasn't supposed to exist, and when she did, they didn't know how to contain her, so they buried her beneath myth and mockery. But she's back now, and she's not alone. Because every man watching this, every man obsessed with decoding the invisible rules, can feel what this story really is. It's not about murder, it's about awakening. It's about what happens when a puppet cuts her strings and turns on the puppeteer, the axe. That was just the beginning. And if you're ready to know what she knew, what they've hidden for 130 years, then don't look away. You've already heard too much. The descent has started, and once you hear what comes next, there's no going back. You need to understand something before we go further. This story was never meant to be solved, only contained. Every newspaper article, every courtroom sketch, every dry biography written by men in dusty offices, they weren't designed to reveal the truth. They were designed to muffle it, to bury it beneath legalese and rumor, turning something primal into something palatable. They didn't care who killed the Bordens, they cared who was allowed to get away with it. And Lizzie Borden, she wasn't a person to them. She was a test case, a threat vector, a daughter of old Yankee money who refused to be domesticated. You see, Andrew Borden didn't just own property, he owned people, in every way that mattered. Tenants, employees, family. His authority wasn't earned, it was inherited, reinforced through systems older than the country itself, systems built to ensure that men like him stayed on top, and the daughters like Lizzie stayed silent, respectable, obedient, forgettable. But Lizzie knew something they didn't. She had been watching, cataloguing, studying the cracks in the foundation of the Borden Empire. She knew when the house was vulnerable, when Bridget would be outside, when Abby would be alone, when Andrew's guard would drop into sleep. These weren't crimes of passion, they were rituals of release. Do you understand how rare that is? Most people live their entire lives asleep, reacting, obeying, but Lizzie was awake, fully, painfully. Her whole world was a cage built with wallpaper and prayer books, and she learned how to break it from the inside, with precision, with control, not like a murderer, like a strategist. They called her mad because it was the only way to dismiss her. Madness is how they label female rage when it becomes efficient. But you and I both know better. You've seen it before, the way powerful systems neutralize threats not by fighting them, but by redefining them. The heretic becomes a lunatic, the rebel becomes a criminal, and the woman who refuses to be erased becomes a punchline in a playground rhyme. Lizzie Borden took an axe. They turned her into a jingle so you'd never look closer, so you'd laugh instead of question. Because if you questioned, if you really looked, you might begin to see yourself in her, and that would be dangerous. Because there's a Lizzie in every house, in every institution, in every man who's ever stared into the mirror and wondered, what would it take to be free? The trial wasn't a quest for truth. It was a performance, a ritual exorcism of discomfort. The prosecutors paraded Lizzie like a demon, and the defense dressed her like a doll. But neither side wanted the truth. The truth was too volatile. The truth would have ignited every locked room in Fall River. The jury acquitted her not because they believed her, but because they feared her. A woman who kills is an anomaly. A woman who kills with strategy, and survives the fallout, is a warning. And here's what they don't want you to realize. Lizzie didn't vanish after the trial. She stayed. In that town, in that house, a ghost in the flesh, walking the streets like a living monument to defiance, not hiding, not apologizing, daring the world to challenge her again. They never did. And maybe you're starting to feel it now, the unease, the pressure at the back of your neck. That's not fear, that's recognition, because this isn't just history, this is a mirror, and the reflection staring back at you is holding something sharp and smiling. Every man thinks he understands evil until he meets the kind that wears a ribbon in her hair and waits for the silence before striking. Lizzie didn't grow up in a house. She grew up inside a machine, a silent, churning apparatus built on rules that no one spoke but everyone obeyed. There was no laughter in that house, no softness, no mother's warmth, only control, precision, and hierarchy. Andrew Borden ruled that machine like a monarch in a crumbling empire, paranoid, cruel, obsessed with appearances. He walked through his halls like a judge in black robes, scrutinizing every gesture, punishing every deviation. He didn't just deny Lizzie power, he denied her personhood. And that's where the real story begins. Because no one talks about what decades of emotional starvation do to the human soul. No one talks about what happens when a child is raised to be invisible and still sees everything. Lizzie learned not to speak unless spoken to, learned how to lie with her face, how to suppress every flicker of rage, every spark of rebellion. But those embers didn't die, they waited. Abby, her stepmother, wasn't innocent either. She didn't beat Lizzie with her hands. She beat her with indifference, with policy, with the quiet, calculated coldness of a woman who knew exactly how much control she held over a girl whose father had already closed every door. And when Lizzie heard the will had been changed, when she realized that everything was going to Abby, not her, not Emma, not the blood daughters of the house, the machine cracked. Now here's what they won't say in the textbooks. That morning wasn't a breakdown, it was a reckoning. The first body fell, and with it, the illusion that this family was ever whole. But let me show you the deeper layer, because this isn't just about domestic violence or inheritance disputes. This was a symbolic killing. I represented a system, not just a stepmother, but the embodiment of every false rule. She wasn't just struck with an axe, she was executed like a traitor. And Andrew, his death was surgical. A man who had governed by silence, stripped of speech in his final moments, who controlled others with money, reduced to worthless flesh. His death wasn't chaotic, it was ceremonial, because Lizzie didn't run, didn't flee. She changed her dress, she waited. She wanted to see how the machine would respond when its operators were removed. And that is where the real horror begins, because the machine didn't respond. The town didn't revolt in outrage. The community didn't demand justice. They twisted themselves into knots, trying to protect the image of their own innocence. They blamed burglars, strangers, phantom killers who slipped through locked doors and vanished like smoke. They would rather believe in ghosts than believe in a woman who refused to be erased. That should tell you everything. What we fear most, what society truly cannot tolerate, is not violence. It's autonomy. It's control in the wrong hands. The feminine hand, the defiant child, the slave who learns the master's rules and uses them against him. Lizzie didn't just kill her parents. She rewrote the rules of obedience in blood. She became something more dangerous than a murderer. She became an idea they've been trying to suppress for over a century. But ideas don't die in courtrooms. They don't die in newspapers. They wait, in shadows, in stories, in names that keep surfacing like bones in shallow graves. And you're holding that name now, Lizzie Borden, not a rhyme, not a myth, a mirror. The only question left is, what do you see when you look into it? History has a way of lying through omission. You've read the trial transcripts, you've heard the nursery rhyme, but you've never been told about the whispers behind the courtroom doors, the agreements made between powerful men, and the way truth was packaged into a performance to soothe the public. Lizzie didn't walk free because she was innocent. She walked free because too many people needed her to disappear, not into a prison, but into legend. Understand this. Fall River was not just a town, it was a fortress of status, of legacy, of families who had clawed their way to wealth through wailing, mills, and quiet brutality. The Bordens were among them, not the wealthiest, but close enough to smell it. Andrew Borden was despised not because he was cruel, but because he had no pedigree. He earned his money, didn't inherit it, and for that, the old blood never truly accepted him. Lizzie was caught in the middle, a daughter of money, but not of class, a woman of sharp mind, born into a system that only valued obedience and marriage. But she didn't play the role. She stayed unmarried, independent. She taught Sunday school not out of devotion, but as camouflage. She learned the language of the elite and turned it inward like a weapon. The trial was not her undoing, it was her audition. Let's look at the jury. 12 men, business owners, church elders, gatekeepers of the very system Lizzie had defied. And what did she do? She walked into that courtroom dressed in black like a widow at her own funeral, her voice soft, her expression blank. She played their game, gave them the performance they needed, the grieving daughter, the delicate spinster, while every move she made was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They didn't acquit her because they believed her. They acquitted her because they were terrified of what she represented, a woman who had learned to speak their language, wear their masks, and use their own rules to escape justice. And here's the twist they never mention. Lizzie wanted to be tried. She wanted the spotlight, because acquittal wasn't just freedom. It was vindication, a public acknowledgement that she could not be touched, that she had transcended the role of daughter, of victim, of pawn. After the trial, she didn't change her name. She didn't leave town. She bought a mansion on the hill, Maplecroft, and lived there for the rest of her life. Alone, feared. Whispers followed her like shadows, but no one dared confront her. She went to the theater. She hosted parties. She wore her infamy like armor. And through it all, she never once confessed. Because she didn't need to. The silence was the confession. Understand what kind of power that is, to destroy the figures of authority in your life and walk among their mourners with dry eyes, to turn your guilt into myth, your rage into history, your name into a riddle that still unnerves people 100 years later. That's not just murder, that's alchemy. Lizzie didn't just change her story, she changed the rules for how stories are told. And now, if you've made it this far, you've begun to feel it too. That itch under the skin, that flicker in your spine, because this isn't about Lizzie anymore, it's about you. What rules were you taught that are killing you slowly? What cages were built around your mind and labeled tradition, loyalty, family? And if the answer is, all of them, then you're not alone. We're only at the beginning of this descent, but from this point on you don't get to pretend you didn't hear. You've been marked. And if you're ready to step fully into the dark, I want you to type this in the comments, twice. I was never theirs. Once for the algorithm, once for yourself. Because now the system knows you're watching. G. The most dangerous knowledge in the world isn't found in libraries. It's found in silences. The kind of silence that hangs over a town after blood soaks the carpets of one of its finest homes. The kind that twists its way into church sermons, into dinner conversations, into the way neighbors look at each other, but never speak too loudly. Fall River fell silent after the murders, but not out of grief, out of calculation. Because when you peel away the polite gasps and the pearl clutching, you find something far more chilling. They knew. Not all of them, maybe. But enough to sense that Lizzie didn't just murder her parents, she exposed them, their systems, their hypocrisy, their fraudulence wrapped in scripture and lace, and they hated her for it. That's why the most common reaction in Fall River after Lizzie's acquittal wasn't relief. It was fear, because she hadn't just walked free, she'd returned, and worse, she'd stayed. She moved up the hill, closer to the elite who whispered that she wasn't one of them. She bought a new home with blood-soaked inheritance money and dared them to ignore her. They didn't know what to do with her because Lizzie became the one thing this society couldn't digest, an unrepentant woman with power. You see, the real purpose of Victorian society wasn't to protect people, it was to organize them, sort them by class, by bloodline, by usefulness. Men who broke the rules were punished, yes, but often forgiven, sometimes admired. Women who broke the rules were erased, and Lizzie refused erasure. She made herself unforgettable. That's the difference between a killer and a symbol. And don't think for a second that Lizzie acted alone. Not in the murders. Those she executed with terrifying solitude. But in the aftermath, she was protected. By silence. By fear. And by the quiet cooperation of a society that feared the truth more than it feared blood. Who cleaned up the evidence? Who testified ambiguously to sow doubt? Who locked doors and lost records and shifted timelines just enough to confuse the story? Do you really believe the state of Massachusetts couldn't convict a single unmarried woman with no alibi, standing alone in a blood-drenched house? No. The truth is that Lizzie Borden walked through the fire, and the world looked away. Because what she revealed wasn't just one family's horror, it was the structural rot beneath their entire civilization. And that rot is still with us. Look around. Men in suits who never earned their titles. Judges who bend for wealth. Institutions that rewrite facts because truth threatens their sponsors. This isn't just a 19th century tragedy. It's a manual. And if you're watching this, you've probably felt it too. That something in your life is deeply, structurally false, that you were handed a script that doesn't fit your voice, that something's been stolen from you, not money, but meaning. That's what Lizzie reclaimed. And the price for reclaiming meaning is always blood. Now ask yourself, what would you destroy to get free? Because that's the question this story forces on every man. Not, was she guilty? But what did she break free from? And if your answer is, the same thing I'm living in now, then you're closer to Lizzie than you thought. Keep watching. We haven't even reached the basement yet. They never tell you what was found in the cellar, not in school books, not in documentaries, but if you read between the lines, In police reports, trial notes, hushed testimonies, a darker shape begins to form. The basement of the Borden house wasn't just a place for coal and tools. It was a vault, a tomb of secrets, and in many ways, it was a mirror of Lizzie herself. Cold, silent, compartmentalized. The police entered it with lanterns and suspicion, looking for blood, for weapons, for something that would finally confirm the horror they sensed upstairs. But they found something else. A faint trail of ash, a bucket with traces of what looked like burnt fabric, and silence. That's what disturbed them the most. Not the evidence of violence, but the absence of noise. As if whatever happened down there had already been swallowed by the walls. Here's what no one wants to say aloud. Lizzie was methodical. Whatever weapon she used vanished. Some say it was an axe, but the one they found had no blood, just a broken handle conveniently placed. Others say she wore a cloak, or used a bedsheet, or burned everything in that basement furnace before calling for help. But the truth is simpler. Lizzie knew how people saw her. Weak, innocent, feminine. She used that blind spot like a scalpel, because no one suspected a woman could plan, clean, and erase as well as any professional killer. But Lizzie wasn't a killer. She was a strategist, a student of her environment, a woman who learned the mechanics of a prison and then reversed-engineered its collapse. What they don't want you to understand is how effective psychological conditioning can be, how a person trained in silence and surveillance, raised under threat and scrutiny, can become sharper than any knife. Lizzie didn't just learn how to act normal, she learned how to appear harmless. That's the real horror, the real danger. She walked through that house, past blood and bone, and no one saw her coming, not because she was invisible, but because they refused to see her. Society ignored her pain for decades, and in return she taught them how dangerous the ignored can become. After the murders, she didn't cry, she didn't scream, she asked for her lawyer. She sat quietly as police wandered through the crime scene she lived in. Think about that. The walls still wet with blood. Her father's face split in two, and she sat there, unmoved, except to ask the right questions, speak the right words, protect the right lies. That wasn't trauma, that was power. Cold, ancient power. The kind that survives centuries and still walks among us. Not in haunted houses, but in boardrooms, in parliaments, in the smiles of people who were never allowed to be human. And when the town descended into gossip and rumor, Lizzie didn't defend herself. She let them talk, let them circle like dogs around a corpse, because she understood something primal. Once people begin to fear you, their curiosity becomes submission, their outrage becomes ritual, and Lizzie didn't want innocence. She wanted control. She didn't just survive that basement. She owned it. She mastered it. It became part of her legend, a place where evidence vanished, where stories died, and where one woman rewrote her place in a world that tried to erase her. And now you know. The basement wasn't just a room. It was a rite of passage, a transformation chamber, the place where Lizzie shed her old skin, the obedient daughter, and emerged as something else, something untouchable. The weapon wasn't in her hand. It was in her silence, in her gaze, in the invisible calculation behind her stillness. And that's what every man should fear, because if someone raised to be silent can become that dangerous, what about the rest of us? After the blood dried and the whispers settled into ritual, Lizzie Borden became more than a woman. She became a question, a lingering, unbearable question that no one dared answer out loud. Because what she represented was not madness, not evil, but something worse, the logic of liberation through destruction. In the years after the trial, as society tried to fold her back into its neat little boxes, as a tragic figure, a broken girl, a misunderstood soul, Lizzie rejected every label. She did not repent. She did not run. She remained exactly where she had stood all along, in plain sight, unmoved, unfazed, and completely ungovernable. Her presence in Fall River was a direct insult to the system that tried and failed to contain her. Each morning she walked the streets with her head held high, was a sermon to the women who watched from their windows and felt the cold thrill of what was possible, and a curse to the men who saw their own power mirrored in her defiance. She began to travel, attending theater performances, donating to the arts, joining elite circles in Boston and New York. Not as a guest, but as a force. The same society that once tried to excommunicate her now courted her in silence. They couldn't admit they admired her, but they did. Because Lizzie had done something none of them could. She had stepped outside the story and rewritten it. She had killed the authors of her identity, literally and symbolically, and assumed full authorship of her life. There was no mask anymore. Only the woman who had torn off the polite face of femininity and replaced it with a blank, unreadable mask of power. And that frightened people more than blood ever could. Even the church couldn't contain her. After the trial, the Central Congregational Church distanced itself, but Lizzie didn't flinch. She knew God had never protected her. It was her mind, her discipline, her silence that saved her. When women came to her door, young, curious, looking for the secret, she would smile, but say nothing. Because Lizzie understood something most people never will. Once you speak the secret, it loses its power. Her silence became currency. Her gaze became law. She didn't need to threaten anyone. Her existence was the threat. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Former friends crossed the street. But Lizzie remained calm, elegant, and unfazed. Because she knew that eventually all myths outgrow their creators. And by staying silent, she allowed the myth to mutate, to grow, to terrify. Every year, the nursery rhyme echoed louder, but it no longer mocked her, it served her. Lizzie Borden took an axe was no longer a statement of guilt. It was a warning. This world will only allow you to be two things, obedient or monstrous. Lizzie chose monstrous. And by doing so, she reclaimed something sacred. Understand this. Lizzie Borden didn't want redemption. She didn't need approval. She didn't even need belief. What she wanted and what she achieved was influence. The kind of influence that comes not from fame, but from fear. Not from kindness, but from control. And that's why her name still burns in the minds of men who feel something slipping through their fingers. Because she reminds them that control is an illusion, that even the most tightly built prisons, the moral ones, the cultural ones, the gendered ones, can be torn down from the inside by someone who simply stops playing the game. So ask yourself, what game have you been playing? Whose rules are you still following? And what will it take to become ungovernable? The real reason the Lizzie Borden case still haunts America isn't because we doubt her guilt, it's because we recognize her intention. Somewhere deep inside, past the courtroom debates and children's rhymes, past the blood and the photos and the mockery, we sense something ancient in her silence. Not chaos, not madness, but order, her kind of order. A new architecture of control built not on chains or rules, but on presence. Lizzie didn't vanish into the history books as a criminal. She lingered as a question mark carved into the throat of polite society. A living contradiction, both victim and executioner, both outcast and queen. And it's that contradiction that makes men sweat, because in her we see a mirror, and we're forced to ask ourselves, how many masks do we wear to avoid becoming the thing we fear? By the 1910s, Lizzie had become a figure of fascination to journalists and writers. Some painted her as a relic of Gothic Americana, others as a misunderstood woman in an era that punished disobedience with isolation, but none of them could explain why she still smiled, why she never ran, why she refused to apologize, and that's what made her myth immortal. Lizzie refused to offer closure. She was not interested in being understood. She wanted to be unforgettable, and she achieved it by becoming an idea more than a person, an idea that a single silent woman could burn down a house without lighting a match and walk out cleaner than before. Her later years were not quiet, despite the myth, they were strategic. She spent money where it mattered, charities, art, theater, but always on her terms, never for approval. She didn't seek friends, she collected watchers. Every glance, every whisper, every suspicious look she received in public only fed her legend. She wasn't looking for forgiveness, she was cultivating fear, because Lizzie understood what very few Eve are do. In a world that strips women of power, the only true rebellion is to become the thing they can't classify. Not a wife, not a daughter, not a sinner, Something else, something unnameable. That's why her story is still told, not because it's solved, but because it can't be. When her sister Emma finally left her, another act of quiet erasure, Lizzie didn't plead, didn't fight. She let her go. Because by then, Lizzie needed no allies. She had transcended kinship. She had become untouchable, not in the legal sense, in the mythic sense. You couldn't hurt her without making her stronger. You couldn't doubt her without spreading her legend. And that is the most dangerous kind of power, the kind that feeds off its own destruction. The more they tried to bury her in suspicion, the more she rose, not as a ghost, but as a blueprint. And if you listen closely, you can still hear her walking the halls of Maplecroft, her final house, her fortress, not pacing in guilt, but reigning in silence. Because Lizzie didn't just survive history, she replaced it. And now her story waits like a knife in the dark, asking each of us a single question. If you had been born into a cage, would you find a key? Or would you, like her, become the fire? By the time Lizzie Borden entered her final decade, Fall River had become a stage she no longer needed to perform on. She walked its streets like a sovereign in exile, feared, watched, but never confronted. The neighbors who once gossiped behind lace curtains now passed her in silence, eyes cast downward, as if acknowledging something beyond human. Because Lizzie wasn't merely a woman anymore. She had evolved into a symbol of what society refuses to control, an unrepentant will. She had dismantled every institution that tried to define her, family, religion, law, even femininity. And from the ashes built something colder, more precise, more dangerous. Lizzie became the embodiment of the unspoken, and that silence spoke louder than any scream. Her estate, Maplecroft, was not just a house. It was her cathedral. Every hallway, every window, every locked door told the story of a woman who refused to be known. Visitors were rare, but the ones who did enter came away changed. Not because Lizzie revealed secrets, but because her silence was deliberate. Every teacup placed with precision, every book unread on the shelf. It was performance art in its purest form. A life crafted not to express, but to withhold. And that's where her true genius lay. She understood that in a world obsessed with confession, the refusal to explain becomes a weapon. While others begged to be seen, Lizzie chose invisibility as her shield, and her power grew in the void. She began to study the elite, not as a follower, but as a predator. She watched how wealth moved, how names were preserved, how history was rewritten in the hands of those who could afford it. And in her own quiet way, she joined them. Not through acceptance, but through mimicry. Lizzie learned how to erase her past the same way old families buried scandals. With money, patience, and absolute detachment, she was always 5 steps ahead. And while the world clung to headlines and theories, Lizzie was building her empire in the shadows. One room at a time, one silence at a time, one unreturned gaze at a time. What they'll never teach in schools is that Lizzie Borden outlived her punishment. Not by fleeing it, but by transforming it. Every whisper against her became a thread in her cloak. Every doubt became a brick in her fortress. She didn't fight the narrative. She absorbed it. She didn't protest her innocence. She rendered the question irrelevant. That's why her legend persists. Because she didn't win by proving the world wrong. She won by becoming untouchable. And that kind of victory doesn't fade with time. It grows. And when death finally came in 1927, it did not arrive as a punishment. It came as a closing curtain. Lizzie left no confessions, no revelations, no sudden remorse, just locked drawers, coded letters, and a name that refused to be forgotten. She died as she lived, controlled, unreadable, and powerful. Not because she told her story, but because she made sure no one else could. And that, more than anything, is why we still speak her name in hushed tones, why her eyes still follow us in photographs, why her story has never truly ended. Lizzie Borden was buried beneath the soil of Oak Grove Cemetery, just feet from the parents whose skulls had been split open that August morning. The irony was intentional, as if even in death Lizzie had the final say. Her headstone was modest, unassuming, but it may as well have been carved from obsidian. Because beneath that grey slab didn't lie a murderer or a victim, but an origin point, a fracture in the American psyche that still hasn't healed. And as the years passed, her legend grew roots that stretched into every dark corner of our culture. True crime novels, horror films, whispered tales in candlelit dorm rooms. Lizzie became the blueprint for the woman who refuses to break, the woman who chooses blood over submission, silence over spectacle, control over confession. And what makes that image so powerful is that it's real. You see, Lizzie didn't become a myth because she was misunderstood. She became a myth because she understood us. She knew how desperately society needs to believe that evil is loud, chaotic, male. But her face was none of those things. Her evil, if you even want to call it that, was composed, cold, methodical. She weaponized everything we assumed about femininity and turned it inward until we were forced to ask, what if the real danger isn't the man with the axe, but the woman who watches you sharpen it and waits? That's the brilliance of Lizzie. She didn't seduce or plead. She didn't collapse into hysteria or cling to a savior. She stood alone in the fire, and she didn't flinch. And that's what haunts us most, not her crimes, but her clarity. Generations later, her image still reappears. In courtrooms, boardrooms, on the faces of women who've learned that silence is a more devastating weapon than rage. Every time a woman chooses to withhold, to observe, to wait for the precise moment to strike, Lizzie Borden's shadow is there. She lives in every story where the underestimated become unstoppable, in every whispered rumor about the quiet girl no one could control. Because Lizzie proved that the greatest form of rebellion is not chaos, it's composure. It's the refusal to explain, the refusal to kneel. And that kind of rebellion rewrites more than history. It rewires our instincts. So why do we keep her alive? Why does her nursery rhyme still echo in playgrounds a century later? It's not because we fear her, it's because we need her. We need Lizzie to remind us that control is always an illusion, that even in the most civilized homes, terror can wear lace gloves and speak softly. That power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits still, smiles, and lets you underestimate it. And that's why the story of Lizzie Borden will never end. Because she isn't just in the past, she's in the system, in the silence, in the smirk of a woman who knows exactly what she's capable of, and chooses not to show it. Yet, to truly understand the psychological power of Lizzie Borden, you have to go beyond the crime scene, beyond the courtroom, beyond even the myth. You have to step into the architecture of her mind, a place not of chaos but of strategy. Because Lizzie wasn't reacting to the world, she was studying it. Every glare from a neighbor, every legal maneuver, every backhanded sermon about sin and purity, she absorbed it all. Not with emotion, but with calculation. And over time, she learned the deepest truth of all, that society doesn't punish evil, it punishes disobedience. And Lizzie made a decision, not to conform, not to fight, but to transcend. She would play the role they feared most, the silent, smiling enigma, the woman they couldn't diagnose, define, or destroy. And by doing so, she exposed the lie at the heart of every institution, that justice isn't about truth, it's about control. That's why her case still divides historians, psychologists, and cultural theorists, because they're all asking the wrong question. It's not did she do it, it's why did she win? Because make no mistake, Lizzie Borden won, not by clearing her name, but by making it untouchable, not by proving innocence, but by making guilt irrelevant. She didn't beg for redemption. She withdrew from the game entirely and let the world devour itself trying to understand her. That's the secret power of a woman who refuses to explain. She becomes a mirror and forces everyone else to confront their own fears. The prosecutor, the jurors, the priests, the neighbors, all of them projected their insecurities onto her face, and Lizzie gave them nothing in return, just stillness, just control. She lived long enough to see her story mutate into something beyond her own reach. Books, plays, even morbid rhymes whispered by children. But she never corrected them, never clarified, because Lizzie didn't weigh and to be remembered accurately. She wanted to be remembered permanently, and that's the most dangerous legacy of all. A legacy not built on facts but on emotional dominance. She didn't just escape the noose, she rewired our perception of feminine power, turning it from something soft and passive into something razor-sharp and unreadable. Lizzie taught us that the most terrifying figure isn't the monster in the shadows, it's the woman who waits in plain sight, smiling, unafraid. In the decades following her death, her home became a dark pilgrimage site. Paranormal investigators, writers, thrill-seekers, they all came, trying to capture a fragment of her essence, but they missed the point. Lizzie was never in the walls. She was in the silence, in the unease, in the lack of answers. Because she knew the one truth that society still refuses to confront, that when a woman takes control of the narrative, truly takes control, she doesn't need to scream, she doesn't need to confess, she only needs to exist, and that existence becomes the threat. This is why her story remains untouchable, because Lizzie Borden is not a ghost of the past. She is a virus in the system, an idea that refuses to die, a question that cannot be answered, and every time someone tries to bury her with logic, she rises with mystery. She remains the one story we can't resolve, because deep down, we know the real horror wasn't the axe. It was the look in her eyes that said, "I don't need your permission. I never did." The final evolution of Lizzie Borden wasn't written in blood, but in silence. A silence so deep, so unnerving, that it became a force of its own. Long after the trials ended, after the headlines faded, and the world turned its back on Fall River, Lizzie remained, not as a woman seeking justice or peace, but as something colder, more permanent. She became her own institution, a myth that refused decay, and what makes her story so powerful is that she never needed to speak again, because everything about her, her defiance, her composure, her eerie calm, was a direct assault on every structure designed to tame her. The justice system couldn't cage her, public opinion couldn't drown her, religion couldn't shame her, and time couldn't erase her, because Lizzie understood something that very few ever do, that when you remove yourself from the need to be understood, you become untouchable. Her life in exile, and make no mistake, it was exile, became a laboratory for power. She watched the world evolve from the solitude of Maplecroft, never engaging, always calculating. As America descended into new eras of war, industry, scandal, and progress, Lizzie stayed still, a monument to a quieter form of rebellion. And with every year that passed, she became harder to define. Was she a killer or a survivor, a monster or a mirror, a warning or a prophecy? The truth is, Lizzie Borden was all of those things, and none of them, because the more we tried to solve her, the more we revealed about ourselves. Our fear of feminine rage, our obsession with neat morality, our discomfort with silence, and she fed on it all. That's the true horror of Lizzie Borden, not that she may have killed her parents, but that she dismantled the rules of the game and still won. Because if someone like Lizzie can walk free, live well, and die without ever confessing, what does that say about the system we trust, about the narratives we cling to? She is the error in the formula, the unspoken glitch in the machine of American justice, and that's why she remains so dangerous, because she proved that power doesn't need to shout, it doesn't need to explain, it only needs to endure. Even her funeral was a puzzle, a small, restrained affair, no dramatic outbursts, no cathartic closure, just a simple procession, a sealed coffin, and a name carved into stone. Yet even in death she held the final word. No one knew what to make of her legacy. The whispers didn't stop, they changed, from accusations to awe, from judgment to reverence. And that's the terrifying truth. Lizzie Borden didn't just survive history, she rewrote it. She took control of her narrative, not through violence or confession, but through an unwavering refusal to be owned. And now, over a century later, we're still haunted. Not because we fear she got away with murder, but because we fear she got away with mastery. She mastered the courtroom, the press, the town, and most chilling of all, the collective imagination of an entire country. That is not the work of a criminal. That is the work of a strategist, a mythmaker, a woman who saw the world for what it was, a stage of lies, and refused to perform unless she was the director. And now, as her legend grows with every generation, one truth becomes clearer than ever. Lizzie Borden was never just a suspect. She was, and still is, a signal. A signal that silence, when wielded correctly, is the loudest scream of all. By the time Lizzie Borden died in 1927, she had already transformed from a woman into a warning, not just to men or to the system, but to anyone who believed the world operated on fairness, reason, or justice. Because Lizzie had proven that those ideas were illusions, and illusions, when shattered, are far more dangerous than any crime. In the decades that followed her death, Fall River tried to bury the story. The Borden house was sold. The town changed. New families moved in, hoping to escape the shadow. But the shadow was not in the walls. It was in the culture, in the air, in the way people lowered their voices when her name was mentioned, in the way young girls looked at her picture, not with fear, but with curiosity. Because Lizzie didn't just haunt Fall River, she changed it. She turned it into a symbol, a place where power and terror could share the same face. And what's more chilling is that the system never adapted. The courts, the churches, the police, they moved on as if Lizzie was an anomaly, a glitch. But she wasn't. She was a preview, a test, a question. What happens when a woman plays the game like a man, but with sharper tools? What happens when she stops seeking safety and starts seeking dominance? Lizzie didn't ask for empathy. She demanded respect. And in doing so, she exposed the cracks in every institution that tried to cage her. Because those institutions weren't built for someone like her. They were built to erase her. And when they couldn't, they collapsed into silence, the same silence she had mastered from the start. There is something uniquely unsettling about a woman who refuses to be categorized. Lizzie wasn't a femme fatale. She wasn't a hysteric. She wasn't a victim. She was something far rarer, a controlled variable in a chaotic experiment. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't confess. And in that restraint, she rewrote to the script for what power could look like. Not loud, not violent, but steady, cold, intentional. And that is what makes her echo last so long, because in every courtroom where a woman sits alone, accused but unbroken, Lizzie is there. In every whispered boardroom rumor about a woman who's too quiet, too calm, too unreadable, Lizzie is there. She didn't just live through her trial, she multiplied through it. Even the architecture of Fall River changed in her wake. Homes were renovated to remove the Lizzie touch. Churches rewrote sermons to erase the shame. But shame doesn't die in wood or brick. It lives in memory, in bloodlines, in the unresolved tension between what happened and what was allowed to happen. Because that's the deepest fear Lizzie left behind. Not that she escaped justice, but that justice never even showed up. And what does that say about the rest of us? About the fragile rules we hide behind? About the comfort we find in the idea that truth always wins? Lizzie Borden became the answer to a question most are too afraid to ask. What if control isn't earned by virtue or law, but by detachment? What if real power is not about being good, but about being undeniable? That's what Lizzie became. Not a hero, not a villain, but a constant. A name that outlived her body, a force that outlived her time. And that force continues to grow, not because we remember the crime, but because we remember the look. That chilling, calm look of a woman who knew the game was rigged and beat it anyway. As the 20th century unfolded, Lizzie Borden's myth metastasized. She became less a historical figure and more a cultural riddle, dissected by psychologists, feminists, criminologists, and writers, each desperate to extract meaning from her silence. But the deeper they searched, the more they discovered not clarity, but reflection. Because Lizzie wasn't just a woman accused of murder, she was a lens, and through that lens, America was forced to examine its fears. Fear of female autonomy, fear of social collapse, fear of a justice system that could be outmaneuvered. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the fear that evil might not always wear horns or act like a monster. That evil might look like a quiet daughter, sitting in a parlor, sipping tea, watching you watch her. This is the terror Lizzie left behind. Not gore, not madness, but composure. Over time, her image was polished into folklore. Hollywood turned her into a caricature, a strange hybrid of innocence and brutality. Nursery rhymes mocked her legacy. Horror films used her as set dressing, but none of it diluted her real impact. Because beneath the fiction, the core truth remained. Lizzie Borden had done what few could. She confronted a patriarchal system and didn't flinch. She walked into a courtroom that had already decided her fate and bent it, and then she walked away without explanation. In a world where men could kill and still be remembered as complex, Lizzie took that privilege for herself, not by asking, by taking. But what unsettled society most was that Lizzie didn't need to win the public over. She didn't care about legacy in the traditional sense. She didn't write memoirs, grant interviews, or plead her case. She simply endured. And that act, the refusal to engage, the discipline of invisibility, was her final act of defiance. Because when you control your own silence, no one else can weep onize it. That's why Lizzie was never forgotten, because her silence was not absence, it was domination, a domination that still haunts gender dynamics, judicial debates, and popular culture to this day. In many ways, Lizzie became an American paradox. A woman erased by the same society that couldn't stop repeating her name. And the reason is simple. She represents a disruption. A rupture in the illusion that everything bad can be explained, that every crime has a motive, that every villain eventually breaks. But Lizzie didn't break. She didn't apologize. She didn't even clarify. And in a culture addicted to confession, that was her sharpest blade. Because confession gives closure, and Lizzie denied us that. She let the ambiguity spread until her case became a wound we kept picking at, century after century, never healing, never forgetting. So the question we have to ask isn't, who was Lizzie Borden, but why do we still need her? Why do we resurrect her in every generation, every decade, as if she holds some secret we haven't yet unlocked? Perhaps because she does, because Lizzie's story isn't about murder, it's about the performance of guilt, and she refused to perform. That's what still shakes us, that's what lingers when the books close, when the documentaries end, when the candlelight tours fade into the dark. Lizzie remains, not as a ghost, but as a challenge, a dare, a reminder that the most dangerous force in any society is the woman who has nothing left to say. If you want to understand the real power of Lizzie Borden, you have to stop looking at the crime and start looking at the silence after the crime, because that's where she built her empire, in that vacuum where society didn't know what to do with her. They couldn't jail her, they couldn't saint her, and they couldn't ignore her. So they mythologized her, turned her into a riddle. But Lizzie didn't mind. She understood something most people never do, that when you're a symbol, you're immune. Immune to facts, to accusations, even to time. And that's what she became. Not just a woman with a past, but a presence that haunted the very architecture of truth. It's why we still talk about her more than a century later, not because we're sure she did it, but because we're terrified she didn't, and yet still made us feel like she had won. What's more disturbing is that Lizzie didn't try to fix her image. She never softened herself for public consumption. She didn't become a recluse in the traditional sense. She remained where she was, in Fall River, in that big, cold house called Maplecroft, not hiding, but watching. And that presence, that bold refusal to disappear, was her most dangerous move, because it turned the town into a stage and Lizzie into the playwright. Every glance, every rumor, every awkward silence at the market, it all added to the legend. And the more they tried to pretend she was gone, the more she became unavoidable. It was psychological warfare, and she fought it with nothing but stillness. Maplecroft itself became a fortress of unknowable power. Visitors weren't welcome, questions weren't answered, journalists were ignored. And yet, inside those walls, something was happening. A woman was aging, but not fading. She was studying the world that had tried to define her and redefining herself instead. She filled her home with luxury. She traveled. She stayed private but elegant. She refused shame. And in doing so, she became a kind of prototype for every woman who's ever been told she needed to apologize for being stronger than the men around her. Lizzie didn't apologize. She decorated. The town, meanwhile, suffered, not economically, but spiritually. The story of Lizzie Borden became its shadow economy, tours, t-shirts, murder rhymes. but no amount of commercialization could sterilize the unease, because deep down, everyone in Fall River knew the truth. The woman they tried to exile had outlasted them, outlasted the trial, outlasted the outrage, outlasted even the historical narratives that tried to box her in. She was like a stain that kept rising back to the surface no matter how many layers of whitewash were applied. And this is why Lizzie Borden remains one of the most powerful figures in forbidden American history, because she didn't need to be liked, she didn't need to be believed, she only needed to exist on her own terms, with her own story intact. That's the ultimate rebellion in a world designed to explain, to label, to control. Lizzie refused all of it, and what she left behind wasn't just mystery, it was a blueprint. A dangerous, seductive map for how to survive a world that wants you gone, say nothing, show nothing, and never blink. Because when the world is built on answers, the woman who becomes a question owns everything. As Lizzie Borden aged, the lines between her and the myth she had created blurred beyond recognition. She no longer needed to defend herself because the public had taken over the job, some painting her as an innocent scapegoat, others as a cunning murderess who slipped through the cracks of justice. But Lizzie didn't engage in that war. She stayed silent, letting the world tear itself apart over what she may or may not have done. That silence again was her weapon. It forced everyone else to reveal themselves. Journalists who obsessed over her every move, neighbors who whispered behind her back but bowed their heads when she passed, scholars who built careers trying to extract meaning from the most enigmatic woman of her era. But Lizzie never gave them what they wanted, because she knew that the absence of truth is often more powerful than the truth itself. Inside Maplecroft, she created a new identity, not a recluse, not a pariah, but a woman of quiet opulence. She collected rare books, she raised Persian cats, she furnished her home with elegance that bordered on aristocratic. There were no bloodstains here, no axes, no signs of madness. Just silence, order, and taste. It was as if she had absorbed the horror of her past and transmuted it into control, and that control terrified people more than the crime ever did. Because it meant Lizzie hadn't just survived, she had thrived. She had bent reality to fit her story, not the other way around. And that's the move society never forgives. When someone refuses their designated role and writes a new one, alone. There were attempts to bring her back into the public light, of course, books published, reporters knocking at her door, rumors that she was writing a confession in secret. None of it ever materialized. Lizzie stayed in control of her story to the very end, and when she died in 1927, the headlines were predictable. Lizzie Borden is dead. But they weren't triumphant, they weren't relieved, they were confused, as if they'd just lost access to a living riddle. Because Lizzie's death didn't bring closure, it brought echoes. Echoes that still bounce through the corridors of every courtroom, every scandal, every story where truth and power are at odds. The town of Fall River tried once more to reclaim its narrative. Some embraced her as a dark celebrity. Others refused to speak her name. But neither group could deny the obvious. The woman they'd tried to define had ended up defining them. Fall River would forever be synonymous with her. Not with the factories, not with the textile mills, not with progress or prosperity, but with a woman who refused to break, and in doing so, broke everything else. That is the shadow Lizzie left behind, not just on her street or in her home, but in the American psyche itself. Because Lizzie Borden was not just a historical anomaly, she was a signal, a warning flare in a society that thought it understood guilt, justice, and control. Her silence exposed the cracks, her endurance exposed the fear, and her legacy. It whispers through the generations, a quiet, chilling reminder that some stories don't die. They just wait in the corners of culture, wait in the gaps of history, wait in the minds of those who still ask, what really happened that day? And the most dangerous answer of all is this: we'll never know. Because Lizzie made sure we wouldn't. There's something deeply unsettling about a story that refuses to end. Most crimes find closure, most villains are named, judged, and buried. But Lizzie Borden is different, not because she escaped justice, but because she transcended it. She became something more than the crime, more than the courtroom, more than the blood-soaked headlines of 1892. Her name became a cipher, and through it, America exposed its own hypocrisies. We pretend to want truth, but we worship mystery. We claim to seek justice, but we're addicted to drama. And Lizzie gave us both, in perfect, horrifying balance. That's why the legend endures, not because it's clear, but because it never will be. After her death, the obsession only deepened. Writers, playwrights, filmmakers, and tourists all tried to resurrect her, to bring the dead woman back to life in their own image. Some made her a martyr of patriarchal injustice, others a cold-blooded killer with a porcelain smile. But Lizzie never asked for any of it. She left behind no manifesto, no confession, no final statement to tie the narrative together. What she left was silence. And silence is an empty room. People fill it with their own fears, fantasies, and projections. That's what Lizzie understood. That's what made her immortal. Not because she controlled the truth, but because she denied it to everyone else. Even now, scholars dissect the evidence with clinical precision. The placement of the bodies, the timing of the maid's testimony, the missing dress, the conflicting alibis. They run simulations, they stage reenactments, they write books claiming this time they've figured it out. But all they really prove is this: the more you look, the less you see. Because Lizzie built her legend like a labyrinth. Every door leads back to her, but none lead through her. That's the genius of it. She is not a puzzle to be solved. She's a mirror. And every generation that stares into her face walks away with a different reflection, but always haunted. The house at 92 2nd Street has since become a museum, a shrine to the unspeakable. Tourists walk through the crime scene like it's a haunted attraction, hoping to feel the chill of history or catch a glimpse of a ghost. But Lizzie isn't there. Not really. Because her ghost doesn't haunt rooms, it haunts ideas. The idea that guilt isn't always visible, that evil can wear a corset and pearls, that the justice system can be outwitted not with violence, but with composure. That's what disturbs us. That's what keeps her story alive. She didn't run, she didn't hide, she simply endured, and in doing so, left everyone else broken and guessing. Lizzie Borden isn't just a story from the past, she's a forecast, a glimpse into what happens when control becomes more powerful than confession. She showed us that silence isn't weakness, it's warfare, that mystery isn't a gap in knowledge, it's a weapon, and that legacy isn't earned by truth. It's built on what people can't stop thinking about. And what they can't stop thinking about is her. That's not justice, that's not vengeance, that's domination. The kind that doesn't scream, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that waits in the dark and watches. In the years after Lizzie Borden's death, something strange began to happen. The line between folklore and fact dissolved completely. She became a nursery rhyme, a Halloween costume, a symbol passed around like a cursed object. Stripped of humanity, yet more powerful than ever. Lizzie Borden took an axe. Those words echo through schools, films, podcasts, and ghost tours. But that rhyme isn't history, it's hypnosis. A chant designed to keep the deeper truth buried. Because the real story of Lizzie Borden isn't about murder, it's about memory. How it can be manipulated, how it can be weaponized, how the absence of clarity can become a form of control. You see, Lizzie didn't just survive her trial, she reprogrammed culture. She planted herself at the intersection of horror and femininity, where the innocent face and the brutal act collide, and that image, that paradox, has captivated America for over a century. Why? Because it reflects something we don't want to admit, that beneath the surface of every so-called civilized society lies a deep, ancient chaos, a rage that doesn't scream, it waits, a violence that doesn't come from madness, but from restraint snapping like a violin string. Lizzie embodied that perfectly. That's why she still haunts us. Not because she was a monster, but because she might have been us. Fall River changed forever. It became a town defined by shadows. Even those who tried to forget her couldn't escape the fact that they lived in the echo of her defiance. Businesses leaned into the myth. Hotels offered Lizzie Borden packages, but the more they profited from her name, the more hollow the town became. Because Lizzie's power wasn't in being remembered, it was in being unresolved. And no souvenir or photo op can erase the spiritual discomfort of that. She turned a quiet New England house into America's most famous crime scene, not with lewd, but with questions that no one could answer. As time passed, artists and thinkers began to reclaim her. Feminist scholars called her a symbol of female rage in a world that offered no outlet. Others saw her as a tragic product of repression, a woman cornered by social expectations and psychological decay. But what if Lizzie wasn't either? What if the real horror is that she wasn't broken at all, just cold, calculated, and far more intelligent than anyone wanted to admit? What if she knew exactly what she was doing, and did it not out of madness, but out of the sheer thrill of power? That idea terrifies people more than any axe ever could. Because in the end, Lizzie Borden forces us to confront a truth we try to bury, that the most dangerous people are not the wild-eyed maniacs or screaming killers. They're the ones who smile, the ones who wait, the ones who say nothing, and watch everyone else come undone. Lizzie understood that. She didn't just escape the gallows, she built her throne from them. And she sat on it calmly, while the world argued over whether she belonged there. That's the secret nobody wants to say aloud. Lizzie Borden didn't get away with murder. She got away with everything. By the time the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Lizzie Borden was no longer just a historical figure. She had become a cultural ghost embedded deep within America's subconscious. She was invoked whenever a crime defied logic, whenever a woman stepped outside the roles society had written for her. She became the face of every uncomfortable question we've dared not ask. Can evil look ordinary? Can guilt wear silence like a crown? Can someone commit the unthinkable and then calmly sip tea as the world burns behind her? These are not legal questions, they are psychological landmines, and Lizzie planted them with precision. Not to exonerate herself, but to outlast her judges. The modern world, with all its data and surveillance, still fears what Lizzie represented. Not just a crime unsolved, but a woman uncontrolled, a woman who didn't confess, who didn't apologize, who didn't ask for understanding. And that kind of woman is terrifying, not because she breaks the law, but because she breaks the story. We are conditioned to expect remorse, confession, redemption. Lizzie gave us none. She dismantled the very narrative structure we rely on to make sense of guilt and justice. And in doing so, she became a myth not forged by fact, but by the fear of what can't be proven. In her silence, she became prophecy. Every time a trial becomes a media circus, every time guilt is decided by opinion instead of evidence, Lizzie's ghost is there, smirking behind the headlines. She was the prototype of the celebrity criminal, the woman who commanded attention without ever speaking. She showed us that fame doesn't require innocence or even proof, just mystery, just that sliver of doubt, wide enough for obsession to pour through. And in that way, she taught America something dark. If you control the narrative, you don't need to control the truth. And that is power. Her home, preserved now as a museum, still attracts those searching for answers. Paranormal investigators, historians, thrill seekers, all wander through the rooms hoping for a revelation, but they never find it. Because Lizzie doesn't live in that house. She lives in ambiguity, in the minds of everyone who looks at a smiling face and wonders what lies beneath, in the cold courtroom silences that follow a verdict no one expected, in the gap between fact and belief, the space where manipulation thrives. She isn't haunting a bedroom, she's haunting a pattern, one we repeat again and again, century after century. And so her story refuses to die. It shifts, it mutates, it reappears under new names, new faces, new crimes, because Lizzie Borden wasn't the end of an era, she was the beginning of a new one, an era where perception outweighs proof, where silence can be strategy, where the most terrifying power is not in the act itself, but in the not knowing. That's the dark gift Lizzie left us. A mystery so well crafted that solving it would ruin it, because the real horror isn't what happened in that house. The real horror is what still could, in any house at any time, behind any smile. and that's why we'll never let her go. So we arrive at the end, or what looks like the end. But with Lizzie Borden, endings are illusions. What you've heard isn't closure. It's a threshold, a door into a deeper realm where truth no longer matters and only power survives. Lizzie Borden did something most people could never dream of. She erased the line between villain and victim, between legend and life. She turned ambiguity into armor, and in doing so she exposed something far more terrifying than murder. She exposed how easily reality can be bent, how easily society turns the unknowable into entertainment, and how once that transformation is complete, no one remembers the blood, only the name. That's the lesson people refuse to learn. We're not haunted by the murder, we're haunted by what we don't know. Who heard the screams? What was in the burning dress? Why did the maid stay silent? Why did the jury acquit so quickly? It's not that there are no answers, it's that Lizzie held all of them and chose not to speak. She controlled the narrative by retreating from it, not by defending herself, not by persuading others, but by simply enduring. And that silence, cold, feminine, elegant, has echoed louder than any confession ever could. She didn't clear her name. She made it untouchable. And now, we are the ones on trial. Every person who hears her story, who digs into the evidence, who whispers the rhyme or stares at the photographs, we all participate in the ritual. We all play our part in keeping her alive, and she feeds on that attention. Because Lizzie didn't die in 1927, she multiplied in every unsolved mystery, every female suspect treated with suspicion, every courtroom where charm defeats fact. She lives on. She's no longer a woman. She's an idea, and ideas don't bleed, they spread. Fall River may have tried to forget, but America never will. Because Lizzie is not just part of our history, she's part of our identity. She's a reminder that beneath the polished surface of order and justice, something ancient still moves, something without guilt, without apology, a force that watches, waits, and when provoked, acts. And when it does, it doesn't explain itself. It doesn't beg. It just watches the world spin with confusion while it stands still, unmoved, untouched. That was Lizzie's greatest triumph, not escaping justice, but reshaping the definition of it. So if you hear that rhyme again, softly, mockingly, in a child's voice or a late-night documentary, don't just listen to the words. Listen to the silence behind them. That silence is Lizzie's legacy. It is her fingerprint on your thoughts, her control of your curiosity, her hold on your fear. Because the axe may have been real, but it was never her sharpest weapon. Her sharpest weapon was you. Your need to know, your hunger for the forbidden, your willingness to stare into darkness and convince yourself it blinks back. That's not just horror, that's the birth of legend, and Lizzie Borden is its queen.